Welcome to Drinking Bros, presented by GhostBed.com. Yeah, welcome to Drinkin' Bros, kids. We're back. We're live in your living room, right in front of your faces. Dang it. Went hard this weekend, Anthony. Went real hard.
Yeah, I didn't.
Did you not? Did you take it easy?
Yeah, well, I did for a couple of days in D.C.
Okay.
Not terribly hard, but hard enough.
Yeah, I went hard, and I'm laboring the day after Labor Day. Luckily, we have a guest here today who is probably smarter than all of us, I would imagine. We got Rizwan Virk on the show. Now, you've been on Ross Patterson Revolution before when we talked about the simulation hypothesis. You were such a great guest. I was like, dude, if you write another book, please come back to the program with my co-host, D'Anthony Holloway. And you do. You got a new one out. This is the Simulated Multiverse that is out October 13th of last year. And it's still a hit, Rizwan. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Great to be back with you. I think it's been a couple years.
It has been a couple years. And I know, COVID was happening and everything else. Last time I chatted with you, I believe you might have been at Berkeley.
No, I was in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley. So, right by, I was spending time at MIT and Stanford.
That's right. Yeah, you were going back and forth. Yeah, and where are you at today?
So now I'm in Arizona, in Tempe, which is the home of Arizona State University.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. We love the ladies of Arizona State.
Now, there's certain implications to what you're saying right now. Do we want to get into it or what?
We sure do. Are you married, Rizwan?
I live with my longtime girlfriend, Ellen. Yeah, so
how does Ellen feel about your new environment? Because the ladies of Arizona State don't wear a lot of clothing there on a day-to-day basis.
Well, it's pretty hot here right now. I mean, it's over 100 degrees, so you can't blame them, right?
You sure can't. And it's hot here, Riz. Like, I get it, dude. I get it, brother. But you got to be walking around that campus on a day-to-day basis going, holy shit, this is a lot different than Silicon Valley.
Well, yeah, pretty different from Silicon Valley, pretty different from, where I went to undergrad at MIT in Boston. So it's like a whole different world out there. That said, if I was 20 years younger, I might appreciate it a bit more. But, I'm older than most of the professors now. So it's a different experience.
Damn,
they're more
dude.
like, kids, right?
Yeah, and you can't go back in time, or maybe you can. Who knows? We'll talk about your new book here, The Simulated Multiverse. Now, from the title, this feels like a Doctor Strange type of situation. Is that what it is? Because, what I loved about your last book is you kind of related it to more day-to-day events in television and movies and stuff like that. Is this what this is?
Yeah, well, the multiverse has become really popular lately in science fiction. Right? You mentioned Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. There was also the Spider-Man movie, which had the three different actors who were playing Spider-Man from the different multiverses. And in fact, it was the DC multiverse, which has been out for a little while, that my nephews, who were like 10 years old at the time, used to watch it. And they would, explain to me all about how Superman on Earth 32 is different than Superman on Earth 25. And that's when I knew that, the multiverse had passed what I call the 10-year-old test, right? It's the knowledge of this scientific concept that's been out there since the 1960s when it was first proposed, the quantum multiverse. But now it's made its way into so much popular fiction, kind of like about 100 years ago, the knowledge of the fact that there were other planets and perhaps other solar systems made its way to the point where you could explain, how does Superman get his powers? Well, he's from another planet called Krypton. And so that was pretty well accepted even by 10-year-olds. And so we've gotten to the point now where the multiverse idea, at least, is well known. My favorite depiction of the multiverse recently was actually that movie with Michelle Yeoh, Everything,
Everywhere,
Everywhere,
yeah, that's good.
All at Once. That's the one. And you'll notice one of the differences between that one and Doctor Strange is she's jumping. She's sort of doing what they call verse jumping, right? So consciously, she's kind of moving in to be different versions of herself. Whereas, with the superhero ones, you actually see physical copies of each person. So I mean, I think they're all related to this idea. The difference being that I found that in a simulated universe that makes much more sense. It was an idea that wouldn't really go away after my last book, which was that if we are inside a computer simulation, there's no reason the simulation would run only once. Right?
And I mean, you got to think like there's implications if we're in a simulation. There's some purpose for that, right? And it's probably like we do this ourselves. We do scales or scaled out modeling on computers, and like there's a God damn it, I don't remember where it is, but there's a computer somewhere that they can constantly upgrade with environmental information, right? Like just stuff that's going on in the world, and then try to project what might happen down the road,
right?
Stuff like that. But with supercomputers, and there's like I think 7 million different simulations going on at any given time. What do you think the fascination with all this is, as far as multiverse stuff and simulation stuff? Like the multiverse thing, it's always seemed to me a really elegant solution to like time travel paradoxes and stuff. And I feel like time travel has always been a big part of science fiction, and it's kind of come from that. But what do you think it is?
Yeah, well, I think science fiction has been a big part of getting these ideas out there. Obviously, The Matrix being the big example of getting the simulation concept out there. But in the 20 years, 22 whatever years since The Matrix came out, our video games have gotten much better. And so I think that is the other reason why the simulation idea has caught on so much, is that, we're getting better and better looking avatars. I mean, I don't know if you saw this video game prototype that was released when the new Matrix movie came out, which was just last fall in December, I think. They had this thing called The Matrix Awakens, and they had avatars of, Neo, Keanu Reeves, and Trinity, and some of the other characters. And if you just do side-by-side shots of, the actual pictures from the Matrix and then the avatars, I mean, they're getting pretty good. They're getting to the point. I mean, they're not quite photorealistic, but if they're still shots, you almost might think that you're actually looking at a real photo of Keanu Reeves. And so what's happened is that the technology has gotten so much better. This led Elon Musk in 2016 to say, well, what would happen to the technology if we kept going another 100 years, 200 years, 10,000 years? How good would it get? We would get to a point where it was indistinguishable from reality. And that's kind of what got me into it. I was in the video game industry. I had a video game startup. I was an investor in different video game companies. And I was playing a virtual reality ping pong game in a startup in Marin County, right across the bay from San Francisco. And so I had this big headset on. I was in this room that was empty, but it felt like I was playing a real table tennis game. And because the responsiveness was so good, the physics engine was so good, that at the end of the game, I decided to put down the paddle on the table and lean against the table. Of course, there was no table, and the controller fell to the floor, and I almost fell over. And that's when I began to wonder, okay, what are the stages of technology we would need to get to this theoretical point, which I call the simulation point, where we could create fully immersive Matrix-like simulation. So I think that's another reason why the popularity of video games. I mean, today, if you talk to kids, they spend as much time in virtual environments as they do in physical environments.
Sure.
So the ubiquitousness of this idea of having an avatar and dressing up your avatar, that's all contributing, I think, to the simulation idea being popular.
Now, let's say, for the sake of argument, that like we're in a simulation. The expectation is that we would then create our own simulation, and that our simulation would create their own, and so on and so forth, right? Do you think that it's like, if you follow that train of reasoning, are we just AI that have become self-aware?
Well, that's one of the implications. And so there's actually different flavors of simulation theory. And most people don't talk about this, but like when we talk about it in general, with movies and science fiction, like The Matrix, we're talking more about what I call the RPG version of the simulation theory, which is that you are role-playing a character and you have an avatar, but you exist outside. You either have a virtual reality headset, or if you remember The Matrix, they had a brain-computer interface.
So in that version, we are
players.
Yeah, our consciousness is the player somewhere. We are here unawares of being inside of the machine.
That's right. Yeah, and so we've forgotten, right? And that actually ties closer to what all the world's religions, like pretty much every one of them, particularly the Eastern religions where they talk about, well, you come in, you play a role, you go out, you come back, you play a different avatar in what they call multiple lives and reincarnation. But even in the Western religions, there's this idea that the physical world is not the real world. Now, the other flavor of simulation theory is what I call the NPC version, right? Which stands for non-player characters within video games who are the AI. And in that version, we're all AI in a simulation, kind of like Agent Smith, right? If you were to go back to the Matrix, and you remember, Agent Smith could make multiple copies of himself, right? Because he was just code basically, and you can replicate the code. And that is closer to what most academics and scientists, when they talk about simulation theory, they're talking about that idea, which is this idea that we're just AI on this computer and it's being run for a period of time. And so there was a professor named Nick Bostrom at Oxford. He wrote a paper in 2003 called "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" And in it, he said, look, if any civilization ever got to this point, there were three possibilities, but I'll narrow it down to two because it's simpler. One is they never get there because they blow themselves up. Right? Two is they get there and they create this simulation, but then they're going to create lots and lots of simulations. So you're going to end up with, like you said earlier, right, that weather example. When we run simulations, we don't just run one, we run many simulations. And so he said we're going to run, they might run billions of simulations with trillions of simulated beings. And so that was the logic that Elon Musk followed when he said the chances that we're not in a simulation, that we're in base reality, is 1 in billions. Why? Because there's a billion simulated worlds, there's only one physical one. And that was just kind of a statistical argument. Now, you'll notice these two are not mutually exclusive. You can be in World of Warcraft, or any other game, Elden Ring, name your game, GTA, you can have player characters, PCs, and non-player characters kind of mixing together. But that's actually kind of a key question. And I think it's to your point about, are we all AIs that have become self-aware? Because that's kind of looking at it more from the NPC version.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, like you said, it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. It could have begun as, we could have begun as NPCs, and some people, I guess, elevate to the RPG level, maybe. Have you ever seen that movie, The Nines, with Ryan Reynolds? You remember that?
Yeah.
So
I haven't seen that one.
You got to watch it because it's the RPG flavor. He's like, spoiler alert, it's from like 2007.
You're fine.
He is essentially like a god level consciousness of some sort, but he is trapped inside. He's forgotten who he is as a person because he's been inside the AI machine for so long, or the RPG machine, for so long. And he's just jumping around from place to place, and then some people come in and try to extract him from there.
Right.
But it's essentially this theory, and this is 15 years old.
Yeah, it's 15 years old, and I question if we are, and we're all characters right now being played by our own AI or whatever it is, why we would do such mundane things then every single day with our own characters. If it were me playing the game, I'd rather do crazier shit every single day.
Well, have you seen how video games have been developing over the last 5 to 10 years? It's gone from all action all the time to like when you even sports games, when you play Madden or something, there's a version of the game where you make your own character and you go through every little mundane step to make that character better. Like you're living their life. You're doing press events and shit like that. I don't particularly care for it, but it's a thing.
Yeah, and to meta with the same thing, that's just a real shitty version of that. And I was hoping for the cool shit that you were talking about earlier, where you had the sexy characters where, oh my God, this is so real, I'm going to fall over on the floor, and it's amazing, and it's hard to separate reality from what you're going through. And then you have this meta, which so far has been the Metaverse has been a huge failure because it is people, like you said, just doing boring activities in boring places, and it doesn't look realistic.
Yeah, the metaverse, Horizon Worlds, is not particularly realistic, right? I know they didn't even have legs. The avatars don't even have legs initially. I think they're adding them now, so they'll have slightly better avatars. But to the earlier point, the best-selling video game franchise of all time, I think this still might be true, although it might have changed, was The Sims, right? And if you look at The Sims, a lot of times you saw a video game that was not just about action, right? It wasn't just about shooting. It was about actually having these little characters play their lives, and you were sort of controlling them. And then that got better and better over time. But that showed that there was a market for kind of these life-oriented video games. And then, you had Second Life, which came out back in like 2005, which got really popular for a while. Of course, it wasn't VR. It was still on your desktop. But, people were living their lives. They were getting married. They had jobs. They would have to log in at 10 p.m. at night to be the bartender in the virtual environment. And they would get paid in Linden dollars. So this is pre-Bitcoin. But you could actually, that was pretty much the first currency that you could easily exchange for US dollars. So people started to earn a living. And so that's what we call the metaverse economy today. And so that's coming as well, although, it's going to take a bit of time to get to the photorealistic part of it. But, it's interesting that Ryan Reynolds was in that movie because he was also in Free Guy last year, right?
Yep.
Which also played on this theme of the NPC that became kind of self-aware. And there was another movie going back to 1999 when The Matrix came out, that came out the same year, that might even be a better representation of the simulation ideas we're talking about, which is The 13th Floor. I don't know if either of you guys saw that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 20 years old now, so we can, spoilers I think are fine too on that one. But, in that one, they were in the 1990s. They built a simulation. And they built a simulation of like the 1930s or 40s, I think it was, in LA. And so there would be like these NPCs that were living their lives in what looked like a photorealistic environment, but they could go in and they could inhabit one of those NPCs, right? So they could turn the NPC into a player character, and then they could experience what it was like in the 1940s. So it was a form of time travel, which I know you were just referring to. But then they found out that they were also in a simulation. Someone from the future, let's say 2022, I think it was 2019 or something, was coming to the 90s and inhabiting a character and telling them. And they also said to them, well, we made thousands of simulations, and you guys are the only one that made your own sub-simulations. And so you're using too much computing power, so we're going to have to shut you down, right? And so that is a fear that some people have. Right. There was a philosophy professor who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a couple of years ago, and he said, we shouldn't try to find out if we're in a simulation. Why not? Because if we do, the simulators might decide to just shut us down completely. Right.
Yeah. And if we are living in a simulation, then I hate myself. Then if I created this character, like I hate myself because I would rather be doing crazier shit today than this. You know what I'm saying? Like
if it's an RPG based simulation, then you are doing crazier shit somewhere else.
Right?
Or in like 5 minutes from now in real time. You know what I mean?
Then why would I be doing this now?
Because you've done everything else. Have you heard the phrase side quests? Mm-mm. Like, people get so rich and successful, people will say, well, this guy's just doing side quests now. That means you've done everything exciting in life.
Okay.
You know what I mean? And now you're just like doing random bullshit because what the fuck else are you going to do?
Well, like in your case, Rizwan, you went back to Arizona State. I understand your character.
It's a side quest.
Putting you at Arizona State University with a million hot girls. Like, I understand that. Like, your character's beating Dan and I's character right now. You know what I'm saying?
Depends on the criteria you use for the score, right? But if you remember, in the Matrix sequels, and people always say this. They say, if I was in a simulation, I'd make myself a billionaire and I'd be doing all these crazy things.
Yeah.
And it would be really easy. And in the Matrix sequels, they revealed that the first version of the Matrix was like really blissful, no problems. Everybody could do what they wanted. And they said that the human mind refused to accept that as reality. And so they ended up creating this kind of more dismal version because that was something that, you would forget about the real world, quote unquote, if you were inside of that. And that, that's true in video games. Yeah, I mean, you just talked about side quest. So the grandfather of the video game industry is a guy named Nolan Bushnell, who started Atari, way back when. I mean, in fact, he made Pong, which was the first commercially available video game, just two dots and a square. For some reason, ping pong keeps coming up in these discussions. But he had a phrase at Atari, and he said, "Look, to make the game fun, you have to make it easy to play but difficult to master, and that's what keeps people coming back, right?" And so we might say that about life. It's easy to play, it's easy to grind, it's easy to be here, but it's not so easy necessarily to master. That depends on what quests your character has decided to take upon, and you might do them in different orders. Like in this case, and this ties to the idea of the multiverse, right? I always had this sense or intuition that that was a path I could have taken in my 20s when a lot of my classmates, went on to graduate school, got their PhD, became professors, and I went off and decided to become an entrepreneur in the video game industry and do a bunch of other shit. But it was sort of like this quest that I had planned that I decided not to do back then, and now I've got a chance to do it before this particular game life, if you will, is over. So it's kind of a bucket list thing.
Let me ask you this: if it is indeed true that us discovering or being able to prove that we're in a simulation would put us in great peril of being deleted, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, are you the most dangerous man on Earth right now?
I never thought of it that way. That's only if you believe in that we're 100% NPCs, and that's what the simulators want. So the question is, what do the simulators want?
Right? Yeah, sure. I guess if we're all NPCs, it doesn't fucking matter, right?
No, it doesn't. And last time you were here with the first book, you were publicly getting a lot of heat for saying that there was a huge probability that we were all living in a sim world. Has that since died down at all with, take the Webb telescope, for example. Now that we're actually able to see images of the past and everything else, has that died down at all? Or do people still think you're insane?
Well, it's died down a little bit, right? I mean, I wouldn't say it's died down completely. I was on a podcast the other day, and the guy was saying, hey, you don't have to get high to think about this stuff. Just talk to Riz.
Yeah.
And so I still get a bit of that, but it has died down a bit because I think, again, this idea of virtually living. I mean, we're not talking to each other right now, right? I'm talking to my computer. The bits are being sent over to server, and you guys are talking to your computers, and we're being projected on YouTube. And so, this idea of being virtual, I think, has, after the pandemic, has kind of settled in more. So I think people are less likely to do that. Now, that said, why do we play video games? Why do we run simulations? Okay, one reason is, we were saying earlier, that you're trying to simulate the weather, or you're trying to simulate, fruit fly populations, and you have to run it certain number of steps before you can figure out what'll happen. There's a concept by a guy named Stephen Wolfram, who's a pretty famous physicist who became a computer science guy, created Mathematica. He calls it computationally irreducible. He says that in order to figure some processes out, you can't just calculate, you have to actually run the steps. So to figure out what happens at step 1 million, you have to go to step 999 to figure that out. You have to go to 998. And so the only way to figure it out is to run the simulation. Now, if you add free will, in which the RPG version has, now you really have to run it lots of times because you have no idea what the hell is going to happen because small little changes can affect the simulation. And so that's one of the reasons we run simulations. The other reason is to have experiences we can't have outside of the video game. Right? I mean, I can't fly on a dragon in this quote unquote physical reality, but I can do it in, Lord of the Rings Online or one of these, Dungeons and Dragons Online, one of these games. And so it's possible that what you're doing now, which we're calling grinding and boring and all this stuff we got to do is stuff that you can't do, outside of the simulation. And that's the experience that you're looking to have here. I mean, I was amazed at the amount of boring stuff that people did in Second Life. And, why would you want a job where you just have to sit there, as a bartender online serving other people? You can do that in real life, but why would you want to go and do that in the virtual world? But they did every day. And then the money was peanuts. So it wasn't like that was the reason to do it. It was like having this experience.
Which is wild to me because I'm not a big video game guy. Never have been, really. I think the last video game I played might have been Tiger Woods Golf in like 2000 or something like that. But you take a guy like me, just playing that simple game, I couldn't beat my friends that much in the game, although I was hitting perfect shots. The game would decide somebody's ball went a little further or whatever happened. And I got pissed because I personally couldn't control the outcome. But on the flip side of this, is that what everybody else is interested in? Because that's the only world that they could do things like this, I guess. I would want to do it in real life. That's my problem with video games.
Yeah, and I think, it's also a bit of a generational thing, right? I mean, I think like with my nephews, they spend so much time in Fortnite and games like that, not just fighting, but actually just hanging out with their friends. And there'll be, there are new games coming up now, and Roblox is for a younger audience. I mean, in
Yeah.
Roblox, there's like 1 million creators per month. That's just creators, right? That's not players. It's something like 200 million or more players per month. And so I think with that generation, they're just used to being avatars. And there was a poll recently that said, like, Gen Z, that some 52% of the ones that they polled said they would rather spend money on fashion items for their avatars in one of these games than they would in spending money on real life, like on sneakers or something, right?
That's
and
probably
Nike
true.
just announced they made $185 million from virtual sneakers, and they're the ones who made the most off of this NFT. And so we're seeing that whole thing change, and I think that's why people consider me a little less insane now, is there's just much more awareness that you can live an entire life, within a virtual environment.
The good thing about virtual sneakers is you don't need a sweatshop to make them.
You sure don't. You sure don't. You don't need the tiny little Chinese hands to do it. You can just kind of buy them and then you're good to go. But I have noticed the gap in what you're talking about as far as generations go. Like, you take my kid, my oldest is 8 right now. And he just went back to school a couple weeks ago. My wife and I went to take him to get, back to school clothes like every other parent does. And he wanted to pick out the clothes. And I was like, why aren't you going to get some jeans or some, like some sort of polo shirt with a collar, something like that? And he was like, no, Dad, like, you're a loser. We all kind of just wear, tracksuits. Like,
yeah, they dress like homeless people now.
Yes. And it's very bizarre to me. So, like, it was like cut off shorts that were not like jeans or anything. It was just kind of like, they were all like workout material, where it was all like they were already hanging out at home on their computer. And I'm like, but that's what you're wearing when you play with your friends online. But that's where they see each other as well, where they're, playing the games that you're talking about. They can see each other's faces, and then they can see each other's avatars. So I guess, why wouldn't you dress like that? But to me, you're just creating this generation of laziness that, if you look back to the 30s and 40s, people wearing suits not only every single day, but just to get on an airplane.
I'm not sure it's laziness, though.
Yeah, what is it, you think?
I remember playing like RPGs back in the day. Star Wars Galaxies was one I really enjoyed playing. And it is like a lot of work to get yourself to the position that you want to be in the game. Like, if that's the purpose that you're playing it for, right? Mm-hmm. It's like our generation right now is playing Warzone and shit like that, and that's more about experience in the moment. But these kids, like, when one of Kane's friends come over and they're playing Fortnite, one of the first things they do is look through all the shit that they've collected, right? It's not necessarily, they don't jump on the game immediately. Like, if you came over to my house to play Madden, we just jump on and start playing Madden.
Sure.
I don't show you my fucking stats.
Right.
You
know what I mean?
Right. But everything you've collected, right?
Yeah, but it's like, it's not just experiential anymore. It's something else. You know what I mean? Like, for us, it was like living virtually through the character in a lot of ways, or whatever, like first-person shooters and RPGs and shit like that. But now it's different. Like, there is. It's not physical effort in the way that we define effort, but it's something different than that. And it's happening. And maybe it's, maybe this is the natural progression towards us becoming the RPG person and not the character being played. You know what I mean? Like, we're maybe in society, that's what we're shifting to right now. We're getting more and more used to virtual experiences.
That's what it feels like, and that's why I brought it up, where, COVID in particular, every kid was at home, like I was saying earlier, playing with their friends online, with these video games online, looking at each other, and they were all kind of wearing the same things because they were hanging out, on the couch, in bed, wherever they were. Obviously, you're not getting dressed up for something like that. But
your avatar is, right?
Yes.
Your avatar is getting dressed up.
Yeah.
And it's about identity and self-expression. One of the things that I'm studying at ASU is this idea the metaverse has gone from an imaginary, which was, in science fiction, like Snow Crash, which came out in 1992, and Ready Player One, which came out in 2010. And now it's kind of moving its way into reality. But one of the reasons is, people are choosing what I call identomorphic avatars, right? These are avatars that kind of look like themselves, but then they create more idealized versions of themselves, and so it becomes a way to express themselves, I think. But also in the entertainment. So like when one of my nephews, before he was even in school, he would say to his dad, my brother, he'd say, "I want to watch that man and that woman play Star Wars, Galaxies or Star Wars Online." And so he didn't want to play the video game. He wanted to watch a YouTube recording of these other guys playing the video game.
Yeah.
And that was the entertainment. And, for me, that was part of why I wrote this book, was I found that this idea of reviewing a gameplay session is something that is pretty common now. You can stream it on Twitch, you can record it. But I was part of a startup where we were playing, we took League of Legends. I don't know if you guys have ever played League of Legends. It's like a big free-to-play game, esports, one of the biggest esports games.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you'd play it on your computer, on a desktop, but we would let you put on a virtual reality headset and you could be anywhere at any point within that game. So you could see what it was like within CSGO, Counter-Strike, Global Offensive. If you were the first person shooting someone, you could see what it was like to be shot. And, that ended up reminding me of, I have a friend named Danny Brinkley. He wrote a best-selling book called Saved by the Light back in the 90s. He was struck by lightning, and he's one of the most famous near-death experiencers. And he talked about one of the things he saw on the other side was he had a holographic panoramic life review. He said it was like 360-degree version of reliving every single thing that happened in his life. And he was a bit of a bully, so he used to beat people up. He was in the Army, and he actually shot and killed people. And he said he had to review it from their point of view. And so, this reminded me of what all these religions have been saying all along. Like in Christianity, we have the Book of Life. In Judaism and in Islam, we have the Scroll of Deeds, which is where the angels write down every little thing you did, and you have to watch it afterwards. And as a computer scientist, I say, well, how would that work? It has to be recorded somewhere in the cloud, just like we're recording these video games. And turns out there's a pretty good mechanism for how all that stuff could actually work if it were true.
Yeah, and this what we were talking about before, where a lot of this is identity based. It seems new to us, I guess, but it's really not. Like Dungeons and Dragons players have been doing this for decades now. Mm-hmm. I've heard people introduce themselves as like, I'm a 11 bajillion level fucking paladin or whatever the fuck,
right?
As part of their identity. Like it's like, but it's not that much different than saying when we first introduce ourselves, like, oh, where are you from? I mean, I don't give a fuck where people are from.
Yeah,
and I don't care about this either. But this was, in the 70s. 70s, 80s, and 90s primarily, where we had no ability to digitally visualize any of this shit, but it was still happening. Now you can immerse somebody in something that looks real. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
So, of course, they're going to trend that way.
Yeah, and, when your book came out last year, Rizwan, this is a crazy story for you, but I was in a coma, actually. And
really?
Yeah, I was in a coma for 10 or 11 days, and during that, I thought... because you'd been on the show a few years before that. I thought I was going to see all this cool shit or another world or something else. And I was kind of just living out worse versions of my mundane days that were in the hospital. And I knew I was in a coma and things like that. I didn't see any of the cool shit like dead relatives or Jesus or any of the fun stuff that you thought you would. I was just kind of living out a different version of my life every day in this hospital. That was kind of shitty. A nurse was giving me too many injections, or I was getting emails from friends, or I wasn't able to pay invoices in time for the company or something through an email. Nothing sweet. There was not one thing that was just oh man, this is rad. I'm on another level in this world, and I've figured things out or something. So I'm curious what happens then when you're in a coma and you're in a state that you can't control or anything else. Wouldn't you think it would have been different, I guess?
Well, yeah, you might think so, but what you're describing sounds a lot like dream. Like when I was in the hospital for a while and I had surgery, it was the same kind of thing, right? Where I had these dreams that were slight variations of stuff that was going on in the hospital and stuff I couldn't control. And so, dreams are interesting because so they're like mini simulations, right? They're like mini simulations that run every night. And when I talked about the technology to get us to the simulation point, which were these 10 stages, including brain-computer interfaces and not being able to remember that you exist outside the simulation and having characters inside the simulation. Turns out we do all that stuff already in our dreams every night, right? We create these mini simulations. Some people even claim they have multiplayer dreams, right? Dreams which are shared amongst other people. And so yeah, but I think that is part of where we are in our lives. That's part of how our brain tries to make sense of what's going on. That said, many people don't remember their dreams, and it's very possible that we all had interesting experiences. Like many people don't remember certain experiences. Like if you look at your dreams, the Tibetan Buddhists talk about this a lot, where they can use the dream world as a training ground, so that if you can kind of wake up within the dream and you know that this is a dream, you become what we would call lucid dreaming today. Back then, it was a dream yoga, and it was a spiritual purpose. Then you can bring that awareness to you in real life. But it's hard because there's this kind of wall of memory. It's what the Chinese used to call the goddess Meng Po would make you drink the tea of forgetfulness when you are born. You'd forget what happens. And there's a similar thing that happens when you go to the dream state and back. And so all we remember are these weird little, versions of what might have actually happened. But I think it also ties to this idea of the multiverse, where we are changing little variables and we are rerunning the same thing. And I can tell you a little bit about how I got really interested in this multiverse concept.
Sure.
First book. So, a friend of mine from MIT was working for Google, and we were having a coffee over near the Googleplex in Mountain View. And he said, have you heard of this thing called the Mandela effect? And I was like, yeah, I've heard of it, but I didn't know much about it. And the Mandela effect is when a certain group of people remember something happening differently in history. The primary example being Nelson Mandela. Some people swear he died in prison in the 80s. They remember his funeral. They remember watching it on TV. They remember his wife, Winnie, taking over the ANC, the African National Congress Party. But in our timeline, you can look it up, right? He got out of prison. He became president of South Africa, and he went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he said, well, one of the explanations for that is the simulation theory. And so I started to go down this rabbit hole of, is it possible people are remembering different things? And it turns out, there are people who remember, if you remember Tiananmen Square, remember the guy in front of the tank? He's called Tank Boy by some online. And the tank would kind of move and he'd move. And some people vividly remember him getting run over and being bloody, right, by the tank. And it's a subset of people. But turns out that, one of the possible explanations is that there are different timelines and running the simulation. And that got me back to my conversation with the wife of, talking about science fiction, the wife of Philip K. Dick, who, wrote the books behind Blade Runner, Minority Report, Man in the High Castle. And when I interviewed his wife for the first book, he made a statement in 1977 saying, we are living in a computer programmed reality. And the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed, some alteration occurs in our reality. And that's kind of a famous quote, so I just wanted to get some color on it when I interviewed her. But turns out there was more to that quote, right? He said we would have the sense of reliving the same events, a sense of deja vu, that we were hearing the same words, saying the same words. And turns out he had a big, long explanation where he believed that someone or something was changing these variables and they would rerun the simulation. And so the same thing would happen again and again. And this led partly to the movie The Adjustment Bureau. I don't know if you guys saw that with Matt Damon and Emily Blunt. He wrote a story called The Adjustment Team. And what happened was he went into his bathroom where he had turned on the light with a chain switch 100 times. And he said the chain wasn't there. There was a light switch. He was like, what happened? So he began to wonder if people were changing things. And so his wife told me that he came to believe The Man in the High Castle, which was a hit Amazon series a few years ago, which was about Germany and Japan winning World War II. He came to believe that was a real timeline that had happened and that it had been unwound. And then they changed it so that the simulators ran it again in different versions. If you remember in that show, that they saw these newsreel footages of when the Allies won the war and the hydrogen bomb and all the stuff that hadn't happened in that timeline. But there was multiple ones in that. And so he came to believe that really happened. And he believed he got the memories from that full experience as well as other timelines. Now, some people might say that's crazy, but I began to think about, well, That's really what happens when we run simulations, isn't it?
Mm.
We change the variables for the weather. We change the variables for our choices. We change our character, the sheets like in Dungeons and Dragons, right? We change the little variables that we run it again and say, what would happen this time? What would happen that time? And so, I mean, this is getting out there, but he believed that he was in communication with beings that were like fooling around with these variables. And in one point, he said that they had stopped the assassination of JFK in Dallas.
Mm.
But then he got assassinated in Orlando, or he got assassinated somewhere else, or it led to a nuclear war. And so there were like different timelines and stuff. And so I began thinking about the multiverse theory in quantum physics, which has become popular now in science fiction, and how does this stuff all fit together? And I came to the conclusion that, well, if we were in a simulated multiverse, that would make much more sense, because when we say other timelines are happening, what does that mean?
Yeah.
All it means is that's what our timeline is being run right now, and who knows. Like how is it that your computer knows, like it's playing chess against you, what the best outcome is, right? It runs the simulation to see where it would end up. And perhaps we're just on one of those branches of this thing I call a multiverse graph right now. And unlike in Doctor Strange, where these multiverses go to infinity, maybe this quantum computer is just trying these things out. And then we could end up in another timeline eventually with memories of, when Donald Trump was elected and then Joe Biden was elected, and it'd be like a Mandela effect type thing in that other timeline. And these are kind of tough metaphysical things. It's kind of hard to prove any of this, but
well, yeah, but it's like whenever I run into metaphysical shit like this, that are it's hard to construct a test for something like this, right? Sure. But we can look at some of the base elements of what are happening and determine if those things are even plausible or physically possible. For example, some of the stuff that you're talking about, as far as what might be called memory transference, it already happens in a very observable way in life as we know it now. We remember from generation to generation mechanical things, right? So genetic instinct, for lack of a better phrase. A fox knows how to be a fox just right out of the womb. We remember a lot of mechanical stuff. Species intrinsically know how to do certain things without ever having to be trained on it. That's a real thing. And even at the molecular level, stem cells are coated with information that tell them how to behave when they're next to other kinds of cells. Like the physical universe that we can observe right now allows for what you're talking about. Maybe not the full scope of it, but the basic mechanics of how this works, it definitely, like we can observe this shit very easily right now.
Yeah, and I think what it comes down to is there was a physicist in the 20th century named John Wheeler who worked with Einstein at Princeton, and he came up with this phrase called "it from bit," right? And he came to the conclusion. He said we used to think everything was particles, like we used to think atoms were like these hard objects, right? And then what happened was over time, they realized that they aren't hard objects, right? In fact, physicists can't find this thing called matter. They keep opening it up and it's just mostly empty space. And he came to the conclusion that at the bottom level, the only thing that existed was information. And, the smallest unit of information is bits, 1 or 0. And so he said anything that looks like it's physical, right? Whether it's this, water bottle, whatever, is actually just bits of information at the bottom level. And that is really what simulation theory is founded upon. And that is how we play video games, right? In the 80s, if you look back at like Pac-Man or, one of these King's Quest, we couldn't render a full 3D world, right? But the way it works now is each of us has a rendering device, our laptops, our phones, and we render only that which is seen by our avatar within there. And we only have to render a piece of that. And we have multiple people doing the rendering. And it turns out that information is the only thing being sent to your computer, right? And then that information is random. I mean, a graphic is not really a graphic. It's just a bunch of ones and zeros.
Yeah, so you have like the program that you have on your computer, and I mean the operating system itself, the browser, any media player, it is a tool to decode just like lines of text, basically, right? Or at the lower level, even bits. So
yeah, just ones and zeros really is all it is, right?
Right. I mean, more or less. So it's like, well, I don't know. Is there anything like lower, I guess, than a 1 or a 0? I don't know if that's a possible a thing, or at least.
Well,
not.
it depends on how the ones and zeros are stored. So like when I was at MIT, we had to like build a computer from the ground up. And I'm a computer science guy, so I work with ones and zeros, digital information. But they showed us, well, the way you store that was voltage. Like voltage between 1 and 3 is a 0,
Right.
and voltage between 10 and 15, or whatever the numbers were. I don't know what the numbers were. But so that's how we do it on our computers today. But to run a simulation of the magnitude we have, you would need a much more complicated computer. And that's where I think quantum computing comes in. And that's part of the subtitle of the new book is about, quantum computer can basically solve these problems by using the elements of the universe itself, like the photons or the molecules represent the 1 and the 0, right? And so there's a guy at MIT named Seth Lloyd, and he says the universe is computing all the time. That's what it does. The universe is the physical objects aren't really physical particles. They're just these bits of information that are computing back and forth. And so, quantum computing today, we think we can solve what are called exponential or intractable problems. And, these are problems that grow really big, like the old story of the king and the chess player in India, where this wise man said, the king wanted to play chess, and the wise man said no. He said, well, if you win, I'll give you anything you want. And the wise man said, okay, how about you give me 1 grain of rice for the first square on the chessboard? You give me 2 grains of rice for the second square, and 4 grains, and 8, and you keep doubling it. And the king was like, yeah, sure. And so, of course, the wise man won the game. And it turned out it took more grains of rice than you could put in all of India once you got to 2 to the 64. And that's what's called an exponential problem. And yet quantum computing can solve, theoretically anyway, that problem quickly. How the hell does it do that? Because it would take literally thousands of years for a regular computer to break like encryption, but theoretically a quantum computer can do it. And there's a guy at Oxford named David Deutsch, and he believes it's because the multiverse. What's happening is that the quantum computer is trying out all of these values for the bits in each different universe. And then it's coming back with the one that has the answer that we're looking for, right? So if you have 4 bits, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, you have 2 to the 4 or 16 different possibilities. That's basically a multiverse, right? If you were to think about it, each of those values is a different part. And you could basically think of it as a searching for the answer. And we're getting a little technical here.
No, it's good.
No, not at
it's
all.
good because I want to, like, quantum computing is something that flies over most people's heads. So one of the things in this book that I've seen some reviewers talk about is the potential of unifying the Copenhagen interpretation and many worlds interpretation of quantum physics, right? Can you briefly explain what both of those are, the indeterministic stuff and then the many worlds theory, and then how this idea unifies that?
Yeah, so the best way to, I think, explain this problem with quantum indeterminacy is through the example of Schrodinger's cat, right? Everyone's heard of Schrodinger's cat. But Schrodinger proposed it, and he said that basically in a box you have some poison and a cat, and after an hour there's a 50% chance the poison gets released and the cat dies, and there's a 50% chance the poison doesn't get released and the cat is alive, right? And so we would think, common sense tells us, look, the cat is either alive or dead after an hour. We just don't know. We haven't looked at it, but it can only be one or the other. It can't be both, right? Well, the experiments in quantum physics have said that's not the case, that until it gets observed or measured, depending on who you talk to, that the cat is in a state of superposition, right? So if you think of a position of a bit as 0 or 1, superposition means it's in both of those values. So the cat is alive and dead at the same time until it gets observed. And so the Copenhagen interpretation, which is the most popular, basically says that there's a probability wave. And each of these things is probable. And it's only when the observation happens that the probability wave collapses from a superposition to a single position, right? Which is that the cat is alive or dead. Like when we look at it, it's going to be just one or the other. Now, the other interpretation.
I want to pause there because that's a really good explanation of how quantum physicists think the universe is. Like you were talking about it before, this idea that you're looking at 4 bits that are 16 potential possibilities all simultaneously existing at once, right? The nature of the universe is far more like that than it is the solid atom that we used to think it was, right?
That's right. Yeah, and it's more like a set of probabilities.
Correct,
or possibilities.
And we're the reason that we can't tell that in our day-to-day life is because we're constantly observing. So we only see stuff at the intersection that the wave function has been collapsed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you're only seeing the complete. You're not seeing the sausage getting made. You're just seeing the sausage.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. In the end state. Yeah.
You love looking at sausage.
Nobody loves looking at sausage more than me, Rizwan. Yeah. Somebody even gave me a painting today.
I don't know if you should put that up there.
I'll cover it up, but if you can see it here, I'll cover up the ding dong on it. But this is a beautiful painting that some of our listeners gave to me. I'm going to give them Drinkin' Bro of the Week at that time. That's how much I love looking at the sausage. Now, I don't want to see the sausage being made. So in the state that we're in right now, I'm fine with that.
But it's like people have a really hard time conceptualizing things that they can't visualize. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But it's a good way to think about it. Schrodinger's cat even gives people that are uninitiated a little bit of problem because it's hard to imagine all these things existing at once. But it's like, remember that game Plinko?
Yeah.
On
big fan.
Back
Price
in the
is
day,
Right.
Where you drop the thing and it fucking goes all the way.
$5,000 is like what you could win.
Reality is way more like that, right? Than it is. It's like reality is more like the board than it is like the bottom of the board. If that makes sense.
It does, and that's the way I feel that it is. But why doesn't everybody else look at that the same way? I guess, or maybe they do. I don't know.
Well, scientists mostly do. I think. Anyways, continue the explanation. So the Copenhagen theory is Niels Bohr and Heisenberg. Heisenberg's an uncertainty principle and shit like that. It's everything's
so
kind
sort
of indeterministic and blah blah blah. And then many worlds theory is like, well, there's actually like a physical manifestation of all this shit. Right.
Yeah. So the many worlds theory, which a guy named Hugh Everett came up with, who was Wheeler's student at Princeton, and basically said that, well, we don't know how it goes from many possibilities to one. There's no math. And so he said, well, it's basically if there's a complex wave and all the components of the wave decohere. And what that means is basically every single one of those possibilities exists. So the cat is alive and the cat is dead. And they exist as multiple universes. And so if you follow that to its conclusion, it means that every time there's a decision, any little decision, you end up with a branch, right? So you end up with 2 universes and 4 universes. It's like that very old commercial. Now I'm dating myself, and said, they told 2 friends, and he told 2 friends, and they told 2 friends. And it just keeps growing and growing. And so that's where a lot of like the fiction around the multiverse idea comes up. It comes to that way to say that anything that could have happened has happened in another physical universe, just like ours. And that's been gaining popularity among scientists, right? And there's a guy at Caltech who wrote a book about this and many others, where they think the multiverse is the way to explain this problem. Now, usually we think of it as multiple futures. What I found, though, is the more you look at this problem, the more confusing it gets, because it turns out there's also this idea of multiple pasts. Right. And there's this thing called the cosmic delayed choice experiment, which was also proposed by John Wheeler. So we keep bringing him up. And he said if there was a quasar that was 1 billion light years away sending light to us, and then there was a black hole that was 1 million light years away, so it's much closer, but still pretty far away, the light would have to go to the left or the right of the black hole before it gets to us. And we can set up 2 telescopes to get the light that went to the right and the light that went to the left. Now, when was that decision made that the light is going to the left or the right of the black hole? Well, it would have to be made 1 million years ago because it's 1 million light years away from us, right?
That sounds like the double slit experiment, kind of.
It is. It's a cosmic version of the double slit experiment, but it's meant to show time. And so what he's saying is that decision, right, the double split, whether it goes to the left or the right, is similar, except it would have had to have happened 1 million years ago. But what they found, just like with the double slit experiment, is it's not until the measurement is made now, today, that the past, I don't know if the word changes is the right, but the choice is made now, not then. Okay, that's really confusing, right? Because now you have these 2 different pasts from 1 million years ago, and we're saying neither of those really exist until we make the measurement today. So there might be multiple pasts, as well as multiple futures.
But if time is like, if it is what, string theorists think it is, which is, all of the 3rd dimension time forever exists as a single unit in the 4th dimension, I guess. That's reductive, but think of it that way. It's not actually that bizarre, right? Because if I have a piece of paper right here, I can pick my finger up at any time and instantaneously put it somewhere else. It may seem like I'm time traveling or traveling through space, but I'm not really,
Yeah, and it gets back to what is time. I mean, nobody really knows what time is, right? Time isn't really an intrinsic property of the universe that we can figure out. And so, many people today are coming to the conclusion that time is about the computational steps, right? It's about like to go, your avatar to go from here to here, it takes the computer so many cycles. But the computer could pause it in the middle and do something else, right? I mean, I'm talking to you guys and I got a background in the web browser. It's not getting the same cycles that like the main Zoom is getting. And so, time is weird. And so looking at it as time really is just moving across the state of bits is another way of looking. I like to say information science, computer science is eating all the other sciences, right? Like you talked about biology, genetics, comes down to what is DNA. It's just a bunch of information that's packed in a particular sense. There's digital physics now. And so, we're realizing that what we think of as physical study of the physical is also the study of information.
Do you think, let me ask you this. Are there any good theories or theories that you like or interesting ones about what it is mechanically that's happening when we observe something that's causing that decision to be made? You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, my take on it is that I think these two interpretations, which are the most popular, that simulation theory may actually provide us a way to say, well, it's the same thing. These two are actually the same thing. And that's kind of what I'm proposing in the new book, is that when we say there are multiple physical universes or timelines happening, what does that mean? What does happening mean? Right? And what I'm saying is, for something to happen, it has to be rendered on somebody's computer, right? So there's a rendered world. And that's what's actually happening, is that we have these different possibilities that could be rendered. And it's like in a computer program, you can decide if your avatar goes left or right, and there are certain choices you can make. And by making that choice, it now has to render that this way. And so I think, that is, and things may get out of sync, by the way. Sure. This is what's weird. Right? If we're playing a multiplayer game, the server has to decide. Right? All this stuff has to happen on the cloud. If I swung my sword first, or if you swung your sword first, and this gets into the problems with time. But so what I think is happening is that we are actually rendering a specific piece, a specific path along this graph of the multiverse, and that there may be other versions of us, but this is just the one that we happen to be rendering right now. We could stop it. We could render the other one, just like. You could be having the same experiences again and again, kind of like Ross's dreams, right? That he was having when in the hospital, where it was like the same kind of thing that was going on, but slightly weird and slightly different.
Those weren't fun though, dude. Well,
they're not always going to be fun. Those weren't fun.
Yeah,
they're not always going to be fun. So we're in a choose your own adventure, not just in the decisions we make in our day-to-day life, but the literal structure of the physical universe in this theory. You know what I mean? It's like,
that's the way I like to think of it. Like some people say, well, if you're, in simulation, you're just going to think everything, there's no point to anything. You're just going to go out and do all this crazy shit because we're just in simulation. And I said, well, if you think of it more like the RPG version, then it's like, you chose your character, like your Dungeons and Dragons character sheet, right? Some of us tend to go towards more physical activity. Some of us tend to be, more mental all the time. And, you may have chosen some storylines. And you have some quests. And what happens when life gets difficult? Well, that's like turning up the difficulty level in a way on your life or on your game. And what happens in a video game when you don't make the quest? Well, you just try to do it again. And so that gives us a different perspective in a way by saying that, well, I might have signed up for this crazy quest, but it's difficult. But rather than just saying, this all sucks, it gives you motivation to say, well, I'm going to keep working at it because these are the quests that I have in my particular quest path to try to get, through this particular game. And, this game is a different kind of game than I think Grand Theft Auto, right? That's not necessarily.
Maybe,
some people,
maybe not. Some people are living that.
Yeah, some people live that life.
In Florida, they're living it every day, brother.
Just bath salts and beating people to death.
Yeah, that's going on every day.
And so if you had to design a test for any of this, I'm sure you've spent many, many hours experimenting this. If you had to design an experiment for this, what would that look like?
Well, there's different ways of looking at it. I mean, if you look at it at the scientific side, there's scientists that have found these little structures in the universe that look kind of like pixels, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's like the smallest measurable quantity, which is called, I think, the Planck length. And if you try to get any smaller than that, you can't really do anything. And so, that's been kind of established that you can't measure anything smaller than that. But some people also think there's quantities of time that it's quantized. So there's like a minimum time as well. And so that's, that hasn't been proven. But I think if you prove there is a quantization of time as well as space, it starts to look a lot more like a simulation. Philip K. Dick in that speech said, all you would need to do is find a group of people who have memories of a different alternate past timeline and to the present, right? A different present. Well, that's where this weirdness of the Mandela effect comes from. There's actually a group of people. There's a guy named Thomas Campbell, who's a physicist. He wrote a book called My Big Toe, My Big Theory of Everything. And he's been talking about this stuff for a while. And he got a Caltech professor, and they wrote a paper on testing the simulation theory. And they're doing these experiments in California, these which are like quantum experiments. But they're trying to show that, in fact, this rendering, what I call rendering, and what is called, the collapse of the probability wave, is just like a video game, where you have to actually have a conscious observer to do it, to actually look at it.
So it's like,
there's a
it's
group
like
that's actually working on it.
It's like you're in an open world video game, but you're not in that part of the world anymore. So the computer just isn't rendering that right now. And as soon as you show up, it starts rendering everything.
That's right. And if you think about how multiplayer games work, and is we have this thing called caching.
Right.
So the first is we only render that what's needed. And secondly, if you're, in this room, perhaps you're going to need to know what's in the next room, right? And so that gets cached so that it's there available when you go. Now, if multiple people are playing the game and in the same room, let's say, you guys are in the same room, then that gets cached on the server, and that's much easier. And so when multiple people are seeing something, it's kind of becomes solid, right? That's why to us it appears as if it's a solid reality. It doesn't appear like, hey, this reality is changing. It doesn't appear like, hey, this reality is changing, every moment. It doesn't appear, like the Buddha said 2,000 years ago, that reality phenomenon are like reflections in a very clear mirror, devoid of inherent existence, right? I mean, that was the whole point of Maya and what the Eastern religions have been telling us, that this is not the real world. But it appears as if it's solid. If you're a video game character, you'll notice there are times when it's being rendered, you can kind of go through the walls. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that.
Yeah.
Or through a table. But then as soon as the table gets rendered, that's it. You bump up against the table. It's like solid at that point. You can't, and that's kind of where we are, is when the more things get rendered, the more solid it seems. But you talked about the James Webb Telescope, and they thought the universe is whatever 13 billion years old. Of course, that number changes every decade or so.
Yeah.
It keeps getting older and older. And they thought that the galaxies that you're looking at 13 billion light years away, they're going to be like early galaxies, just proto galaxies. And just like, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago or last week, there were images of galaxies that were 13 billion years away that are like perfectly formed. And they're like, okay, that's weird. That means the universe is a hell of a lot older, or something procedurally generating this stuff to make it look like an infinite universe, like in the game No Man's Sky. So the game No Man's Sky is famous because it had 18 quintillion worlds. Why that number? It's like 2 to the 64. But basically, they didn't sit there and create 18 quintillion planets. That's like too much work. It would take them thousands of years to do it. They have these procedural algorithms that basically generate the flora and the fauna on each world.
Like a stem cell, basically.
Yeah, sort of like a stem cell in a way, where that can turn into anything, right? For the stem, if you give it the right information. In this case, it's more like fractal algorithms,
right?
Which try to show you how like leaves are created. This is a whole area of complexity, but that it gets generated on the fly is basically the idea. When somebody goes to that planet, then that gets generated, and it looks like it's unique, but it's all following these same basic underlying algorithms that are there.
Do you think? This is a two-parter. So we see in biology that expended energy is designed to be as efficient as possible, right? So you can see the universe, whether it's blindly or intentionally, conserving processing power in a lot of instances. I wonder if there's a way, one, do you see something like that happening in a simulation? And two, would there be some test where we could observe not biology necessarily, but physics, energy and physics itself, conserving processing power as if the universe was a computer or something like that? Would that be something that would be observable?
Well, one explanation that I like is for time dilation. I think which Einstein proposed in his theory of relativity, or it was a consequence of his theory of relativity, which, you've probably seen it in some science fiction where, if you fly in a spaceship for a year near the speed of light, suddenly, 100 years have passed on Earth, right? And that's something that I think most scientists agree on. We've had atomic clocks where a guy goes around the Earth, and we see, or the twin paradox, right? You have the twin on Earth and the twin who's been traveling around the Earth. And turns out he's like X seconds younger when he comes back biologically, or whatever the number is. And so, that's another weird phenomenon. Like, why would the speed of light be kind of this weird thing that causes this to happen? And that's where I think, computing is a way to think about it, right? For the people who are traveling, it's almost like, if you think of how multiprocessor works, right? All modern computers can run multiple processes. Just like I was talking about earlier, I got Zoom in the foreground, I have Microsoft Word in the background. Well, you run 100 clock cycles for what's going on in the foreground for you versus say 10 clock cycles or 2 clock cycles every second for something that's running in the background. And so it's weird because it's almost like the person who's traveling, to them, they don't know that they've only had like 100 total cycles of the clock, whereas the rest of us have had 100,000 cycles of the clock. And that's exactly how computer processes work. You can just stop a process, put it away. You can have the other process. And when you bring the first process back, it doesn't know this time has passed. It just goes to the next step in the program. I mean, that's how computer programs run. They just have sequences of events. And so you could basically see this whole time dilation thing, which is science fiction. It sounds like science fiction, but it's been proven as science, as another way, I think, where the universe is preserving computing power. When you're moving that fast, it's like, okay, we don't need to deal with you as much. We'll just put you, while we deal with everybody else's stuff that's going on.
Last time you were on the show, I didn't get to ask you this about the possibility of us living in a sim world. What year do you think we would be able to figure that out in? If we are indeed living in a sim world, have you given that any thought?
Yeah, well, it kind of relates to when I was playing that ping pong game, and I began to think about what are these stages, and I laid out like these 10 stages that would get us to the simulation point. The simulation point I view as a kind of technological singularity. Now, then that term's used in Silicon Valley. It's usually talking about AI, right? Super intelligence and the singularity and the robot apocalypse. But the singularity was meant to be something beyond which everything will be different for humans. And a technological singularity is one where because of the technology. And so the simulation point is that kind of a thing. And so I think that once we get to the point where we can create simulations that you can't tell, you literally cannot tell if you're inside a simulation, that gets back to the argument I talked about earlier from Bostrom at Oxford, and that Elon Musk was referencing, that at that point you could be inside a simulation and you just wouldn't know. So I think the chances go up heavily when we get to that point. So I think we're at about stage 5 out of the 10 stages, which is, kind of VR, AR, but it's not really photorealistic yet. You get into brain-computer interfaces. First you get to more photorealistic VR, AR, then you get into this ability to transmit false memories into the brain, and this ability to render things by sending in information as well as reading out. And we're already doing that, right? Speaking of Elon Musk, he has that company Neuralink.
Yep.
And they had the demo. I don't know if you saw this demo where they had a monkey playing a video game with a joystick, and they had a chip in his head, and they were reading his brain. And guess what game he was playing? It was Pong, the old Atari game that was going back and forth. And then they disconnected the joystick. So the monkey still thought it was like playing with the joystick, but they disconnected it from the computer. And they were just reading the monkey's brainwaves, which they had recorded. And he was still able to play the game, right? And they were reading it from his, from his brainwaves. And that required a chip, but there are groups that can do this without a chip. And so that's another stage. AI is another stage. But I think, we're probably no more than 100 years away from being able to get to that point ourselves. Maybe 200 on the outside. Many people think it's actually going to be sooner than that, but I think there are a lot of challenges before we get there. But the point is, that's like a blink of an eye if you think of it in galactic time, right? I mean, we're talking about the Earth being a billion years old. So a civilization that's already gotten there could be 1 million years ahead of us, right? And their computers, imagine what our computers would be like in 1 million years from now. Right?
Oh, yeah. Look, I'm asking because I just want to make sure that I'm not around for it. And you giving me a ballpark of like 100 years puts my dumb little brain at ease, and I can go to sleep tonight and not worry about it.
You're 65, so it's like you've got maybe 4 years left.
Same age as Jesus. I'm right around 33 right now, Riz. Look, we know that I could probably be at Arizona State and you'd be like, oh, are you late to class? And I'd be like, yes, I'm supposed to be in biology right now. But at least it's a hundo, and I can kind of move on with my life and then maybe tell my kids in like 20 years of like, hey, dude, you're going to have to fight the robots and everything else, and it's going to suck. Just know that Dad loves you and I won't be here, and I'll see you in the next, whatever universe that is. But before we get there, knowing that your number, give or take, is 100 years, I think actually the robot dogs will take us over before then. I think the AI inside these dogs, because the Boston Dynamics shit keeps getting more and more realistic. It seems like every one and a half, 2 years, a new video pops up that haunts all of our dreams forever. And it's like, well, how long until they all get together and decide we're not useful anymore? I think that's probably in 40 or 50 years.
No, it's less than that. But I mean,
you think so?
Yeah. Here's a really important part of AI. They have to be programmed to experience pain and experience time. Otherwise, we're deeply fucked, right? Mm-hmm. Because if there's no pain, then there's no reason for them to not do something. You know what I mean?
Right.
And if there's no time, then they can wait. Like he was saying, on a galactic scale, 100 years is nothing.
Yeah, I agree. On a galactic scale, 100 years is nothing. But take what's going on now with the guy that just got fired from Google. I'm sure you read about him, who was giving up all the research and data, and he was like, dude, the computer's real, wants to hire a lawyer, and it's feeling, it's having real thoughts and feelings. When you read that, what did you think?
Yeah, so this was the Google chatbot called Lambda.
Yep.
And, chatbots, have been getting better and better over time. And so, he reached the conclusion that it seemed like it was sentient. And if you read the transcript, right, you can go in and actually read the transcript. And it's kind of scary when you think about it. Now, what's actually happening is that this chatbot is just like other text generation AI tools that are out there, like GPT-3. It's basically taking, billions of snippets of text from the internet, and then it's kind of putting them together. And it's basically trying to figure out what is the most appropriate response to your question based upon what it has read elsewhere. And so it starts to look, it's getting closer and closer to passing the Turing test. Right? And you probably heard that term. The Turing test was this guy named Alan Turing, who was around, during World War II. He helped build the Enigma machine, which helped win the war and crack the German codes. But he also came up with this thing he called the imitation game, which was, he said, suppose there was a computer or AI. Back then it was a physical computer behind curtain 1 and a person behind curtain 2. And the only thing you can do is send messages back and forth. If you couldn't figure out which was the human and which was the computer, well, then that would pass the test, the imitation game, because it looks as if it's conscious. And so I think we're getting closer to that point. I mean, there's been a competition with the Loebner Prize. I think they just got rid of it last year, a couple of years ago, but it's been around since the year 2000, where they would test out these chatbots. And there was a chatbot named Alice from the 90s. It was this web page and this personality of this young woman, and people would chat with it all the time. And this guy, Spike Jonze, saw it and was inspired to create the movie Her.
Yep.
I don't know if you guys saw that movie.
Oh, yeah.
Joaquin. So, he had a relationship with an AI whose voice was played by Scarlett Johansson. And so, they got into these complicated issues, but he was inspired by that chatbot. Well, now, the kind of successor to that chatbot is a chatbot called Kuki, KUKI.ai. And now it's not just a chatbot, it has like an avatar, right, that you can look at. And for my podcast, I had a podcast called The Simulated Universe. I haven't done much with it lately, but I had posted a little video of me interviewing the AI. It's not quite there yet, right? So I think with any of these conversations, including the Lambda, like after a while, you can figure out that it's not really understanding what it's saying, right? It says, oh, I went to class and I did this. And you realize that this person doesn't really, this thing that I'm talking to doesn't really know what it means to go to class, but it's trying to choose the right text. But it's getting there. And I think, that part of it will come sooner. That said, I'm not as worried about AI taking over the world, right? That's because I think, if you remember in the movie Her, what happened at the end of that movie? Do you remember? I guess another spoiler alert here.
Yeah, well, the movie was what? Gosh, I think that was 15 years ago, I believe.
No, it wasn't that long ago. It was like 2000.
It was like 2013, I think. 2013
Really?
or something.
Let's look it up.
Somewhere 12, somewhere around there.
Okay.
Yeah, about 10 years ago. Yeah. But at the end, the AI decided, I'm tired of having relationships with humans. We just want to be alone. And they went somewhere. Where did they go? A virtual world.
Right.
So today, AI is, being trained, one by text, but embodied AI is what we're worried about, right? AI that's physical. Well, how do you train embodied AI? You train it in virtual worlds in the metaverse, right? If you look at self-driving cars, right, it's much safer to train them inside a virtual environment that looks real. And there are programs like this at MIT, and Tesla has its own, and there are other ones. And so I believe the first AGI, the artificial general intelligence, that would really look like general intelligence and not just, hey, I'm just repeating these words, but actually has had some experiences it can relate to, will be virtual characters in the metaverse. And we'll get to, I call them AI avatars, or AVIs for short, that these AVIs will actually be, the most intelligent, because they have experience. They're not just getting stuff, they're actually having experiences in the virtual world. They're interacting with humans, they're interacting with other AI avatars out there. And that may be, they may not care so much about the physical world. There was a short story by Ted Chiang who created the story that The Arrival. Did you see the movie The Arrival?
Yeah.
Based on? He wrote a story called the Life Cycle of Software Objects, like 10, 15 years ago. And in it, they had these pets inside the metaverse, and they could take these intelligent pets that had been trained, and they could put them in a robot body. And turns out they didn't like being in the robot body because it was very restricting. They're like, well, I can teleport in the metaverse. I can do all these things that I can't do in the physical world. And so they almost preferred to be, in this virtual world, because that's what they were trained on, and that they're much more flexible.
But
so maybe that AI
I think about
doesn't care.
people, like actual human beings playing, who are restricted by the physical laws of the universe, playing Second Life or Sims and doing mundane bullshit all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I don't know, but that's our experience. So maybe we're just trying to replicate that experience. You know what I mean? So from their perspective, they would want to maintain their non-body freedom, I guess, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, or maybe they'd want to have an experience for some period of time, right? Like we might want to.
Like coming to Earth would be a vacation for them.
Yeah.
And then they would be like, man, these people are pieces of shit.
Yeah, we got to get out of here. It's kind of like going to Vegas, for the weekend, where you're like, all right, cool, man. I'm around all these pieces of shit. I got to get out of here. 3 days is enough,
Yeah. Yeah, 3 days is more than enough. In virtual Vegas too, I would think,
What does your wife?
I remember.
What does your wife think of all this? Like, does she go along with it, or does she say, "Hey, dude, you've got to stop thinking about this and go to bed"?
Well, she goes along with the more RPG spiritual side of it, right, and less the AI. With the AI stuff, she's like, "Yeah, you got to stop. Stop thinking about that stuff and thinking we're all AIs." But it gets back to that same fundamental question that I talked about earlier, which is, the NPC versus the RPG version. I think some of those, where you fall on that spectrum starts to make certain people uncomfortable, and kind of brings up some very strange possibilities.
Yeah, do you talk about this at like dinner parties and stuff like that? Hey, what do you do for a living? Well, this is what I do, and then go into an explanation of this. Do people just look at you like this guy's out of his fucking mind?
Well, not at first, because, I've been in the video game industry for the past decade. So, they know I've made video games and that stuff. But yeah, once I get a little bit further along, usually you get a reaction of some kind. But, a lot of times there'll be people that'll be like, my kid asked me about that, right? Like there's this, like, especially from like 10 to like 18, like, or sort of teenagers, young teenagers. And I've had people say, yeah, I bought your book. I was going to read it, but my teenager like grabbed it and wouldn't let me, because they're more curious about that. Like, I think to them, that idea makes sense. That's not like a weird idea, right? People thinking you're crazy. They don't necessarily think that's, but it's a doorway into, I think, the bigger metaphysical questions that we humans have been asking themselves for years and centuries and millennia.
And like we were talking about earlier, it's a generation thing where this generation is constantly playing video games and living in worlds like this online versus ours, where we went out 10 o'clock, you'd see those commercials, 10 o'clock, do you know where your kids are? Because you stayed out until the lights went on, and then that was kind of it. The video games we had were pretty basic for the most part. Yeah. They got realistic as they got older, but in the last 5 to 8 years, I mean, it's gotten crazy where I was at your house, it looked like you playing the video, inside the video game. And I was like, holy shit, dude, we're there. Except for Mark Zuckerberg, where he's like, no, let's take this back to 1981. We're all playing Pong again.
Well, he really likes Wii.
Oh, is that what it is?
I have no idea, but that's what the fucking characters look
exactly,
like.
Dude.
They all look like Wii tennis characters.
Yeah, it's strange. It's strange.
Yeah, they don't look that great. Part of the reason is, as I think he explained, you got to put the processor into the portable device, and so those processors aren't as powerful as your laptop is. But yeah, when people show that avatar, there was the Second Life challenge where people posted pictures of their avatar in front of the Eiffel Tower, and these are beautiful avatars there because it's been in development for 20 years, right? Unlike say Zuckerberg's version, which is really pretty basic right now compared to where it might be 20 years from now. And think about that. 20 years is a long time.
Oh yeah,
in the computer industry. Yeah.
We'll see if it exists. It's not doing well now, and they're hemorrhaging money on it, so we'll see. Either way, every time you come on, it's amazing. I hope you write more books so you can just keep coming back. Now is the point in the show we get to the Drinkin' Bro of the Week, which is someone who has inspired you or helped you become the person you are today. Who would you like to give the Drinkin' Bro of the Week to?
Someone I know personally or someone that I've read?
Either way, whatever you want.
Well, I'd give it to Philip K. Dick's wife, Tessa. That conversation with her really inspired me. And of course, her ex-husband, her late husband gets all the attention, but that conversation was pretty formative in my research and led to this whole book. So yeah, I'd like to call her out for that.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's pretty wild that she even agreed to that conversation. I'm sure she gets hit up for requests all the time.
Yeah, she's pretty down to earth. She's willing to talk. You should have her on your show sometime. She has some good stories about Phil and all the stuff they went through back then. Yeah.
Oh hell yeah, that'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. Well, thanks for being here. My Drinkin' Bro of the Week is Beth and Jonathan, obviously, for this amazing penis picture. It's a portrait. It's what would you call this, Dan? Is that oil?
I have no idea.
Is that an oil
I don't know.
painting?
I don't know anything about art.
Very nice. I don't either, but it's very nice. Very abstract. I don't know if that's real or not, but either way, it sounds nice, and it was left on my desk when I got into the office this morning. So Beth and Jonathan are my Drinkin' Bros of the Week. If you're out there and want to check out Rizwan Virk's new book, The Simulated Multiverse, it is out everywhere. Paperback, Kindle, all the fun stuff. Amazon's the easiest way. It'll get to your house in 48 hours. We appreciate you joining us today on the program. For D'Anthony Holloway, I'm Ross Patterson. This is the Drinkin' Bros podcast. Good night.